The simplest questions are the ones we spend our whole lives learning how to answer. Nobody in the studio that afternoon knew what Thomas Avery did for a living until he told them. And when he told them, the room did not react the way rooms usually react to facts, with mild interest, with a nod, with the audience's polite and brief engagement before the game moved on. The room stopped. The room stayed stopped. And what happened inside that stopping was the thing that 91 million people watched in the days that followed, and that still, a year later, arrives unrequested in the feeds of people who were not looking for it but find, upon watching it, that they needed it. The simple question was, what do you do? Steve Harvey had asked it 10,000 times. He would ask it 10,000 more. It was the question that opened people, that gave them permission to say who they were in a room full of strangers, that transitioned a conversation from logistics to identity. He asked it with the same warmth he always used, the same forward lean, the same genuine interest, because it was genuine. That was the thing people underestimated about Steve Harvey. The interest was always genuine, which was why the answers occasionally surprised even him. Thomas Avery was 59 years old. He was from Meridian, Mississippi. He was a compact, still man with the quality of someone who has developed, over a long time, the ability to be in a room without demanding the room's attention. Not from shyness, not from insecurity, but from a kind of practiced selflessness, the orientation of a person who has spent years caring about other people's experience more than their own. He wore a gray suit that fit him well, and a tie that his wife had chosen and that he had protested mildly, and that was, she had been right, exactly correct. His wife's name was Josephine. She was 56, and she was standing to his left on the stage with the expression of a woman who has been married to a particular kind of man for 31 years and has not yet finished being grateful for it. She was a high school art teacher. She had tried, on the drive to the studio, to prepare herself for whatever the day would bring, and had decided on the freeway at 65 miles per hour that preparation was not available for this, which had turned out to be correct. The rest of the family was their son Marcus, 31, who worked in urban planning and who had his father's stillness and his mother's eye for composition. Their daughter Celine, 28, who was a pediatric nurse and who had the focused warmth of someone who has chosen, professionally and personally, to spend their life in service to people at their most vulnerable. And Thomas's younger brother Eugene, 56, who had driven from Jackson and who was louder than Thomas in every register and who had been his brother's opposite and closest companion for 56 years, the way opposites sometimes are when they share a foundation. They had been introduced to the warm and genuine applause that audiences give families who appear, from a distance, to be rooted in something real. Steve Harvey had moved through the family with his usual ease, trading jokes with Eugene, whose volume and speed were perfectly calibrated for the format, asking Josephine about teaching, which she answered with the enthusiasm of someone who has not gotten tired of their subject in 30 years, drawing Celine out on what it was like to work in pediatrics, which she described in one sentence as the hardest and most worthwhile thing I know how to do, which Steve Harvey had repeated back quietly, as if recording it. Then he came to Thomas. He asked what Thomas did. Thomas was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone gathering language, the quiet of someone deciding how much of the true answer to give, and then deciding all of it. He said, I sit with people when they're dying. The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey did not move. He said, say that again. Thomas said, I'm a hospice volunteer. I have been for 19 years. I sit with people in the last days and hours of their lives. People who would otherwise be alone. He paused. I hold their hands. I talk to them if they want to talk. I sit in the quiet if they don't. He stopped. I've been with 412 people when they died. The studio fell completely silent, and this time the silence was not brief. It was the silence of a room that has just received information it was not prepared to receive, that has had to expand to hold something larger than it expected to hold. Steve Harvey looked at Thomas Avery for a long moment. He said, 412. Thomas said, I count. It seemed right to count. It seemed right that each one be a number and not just a general accumulation. Steve Harvey pressed his lips together once. He said, Why? Thomas said, Because they were each a person, and counting is a way of saying, you were each a person, and I remember that. The studio fell completely silent. In the front row, a woman had both hands pressed flat against her face. Beside her, a man she had never met before today put his hand briefly on her arm and then removed it, the instinctive comfort of a stranger who has decided that proximity matters more than introduction. Steve Harvey sat with what Thomas had said for a moment, not performing the sitting, but doing it, the way he had sat with things on this stage before, the way he had learned, across years of standing in front of families and their true stories, that some things needed to be held before they could be responded to. He said, How did you start? 19 years ago, what made you walk into a hospice and say, I'll do this? Thomas said, My mother died alone. He said it the way he said everything, evenly, precisely, without reaching for drama because the fact itself contained everything the drama would only dilute. She was in a hospital in Meridian. She died at 2 in the morning. None of us knew it was that night. The nurse called at 2:47 a.m. I got there at 3:15. He stopped. She had been alone for 43 minutes. He said, I have thought about those 43 minutes every day for 20 years. He said, I cannot go back and undo them. I can make sure they don't happen to someone else, so that's what I do. The studio fell completely silent. Josephine, beside him, had closed her eyes. She had heard this story. She had been there for the 2:47 call. She had been the one driving to the hospital at 3 a.m. She had been the one who had understood, in the weeks after, what those 43 minutes were doing to her husband, and had watched him, with the attentiveness of a woman who loves someone with her full attention, transform them into a practice. She had never heard him say it in public. She was standing with her eyes closed and her hands still at her sides in the way of someone receiving something that is both known and new. Familiar in its content, new in the weight of hearing it said in a room full of strangers who were becoming, in real time, something else. Celine, the pediatric nurse, was looking at her father with an expression that was not surprise, but was the deepening of something she had always known. The specific deepening that happens when a parent's story, which you have carried partially and second-hand, suddenly becomes whole in front of you. She had gone into nursing, she had always said, because of her father. She was, at this moment, understanding that more fully than she had before. Marcus, the urban planner with his father's stillness, was looking at his own hands. He was 31 years old, and he was doing, quietly and privately, an accounting of something. Nobody asked him what. The camera caught his face for 4 seconds in the wide shot, and it was enough. Eugene, loud, fast, his brother's opposite and closest companion, had gone somewhere entirely interior. He was 56 years old, and he had known Thomas since Thomas was born, and he had known about the hospice work, and he had known about their mother's 43 minutes, and he had watched his brother for 19 years walking through a door that Eugene could not have walked through himself. And he was standing on a game show stage, feeling the full weight of all of that land on him simultaneously, in a way that 19 years of gradual accumulation had not managed. A camera operator at the center rig had bowed his head. The production crew, 3 members visible in the wide shot, had stopped performing invisibility. The stage manager was at the edge of the set with her headset off. Steve Harvey turned to the audience. He did not speak immediately. He turned to the camera. He said, "I want to talk to everyone watching at home." He said it in the register that meant the game had stopped, that something more important was in the room. This man has been sitting with dying people for 19 years. He doesn't get paid. He doesn't get recognized. He walks into rooms where there is no good outcome, where everything has already happened or is about to. And he sits there, and he holds a hand, and he makes sure that no one spends the last minutes of their life without another person in the room. He paused. He has done that 412 times, he counts, because each one was a person. He stopped. He said, "I don't know how to put that in a category I already have. I don't have a category for that. I've met a lot of people on this stage. I have never met this." The studio fell completely silent. Then he turned back to Thomas and he said, "Can I ask you something personal?" Thomas said, "Yes." He said, "What does it do to you? 19 years of this. What does it do to a person?" Thomas considered the question with the seriousness he brought to everything. He said, "It makes you very clear about what matters." He said, "You cannot sit with someone at the end of their life and come away confused about what was important. The things people talk about at the end," he stopped. "They don't talk about their careers. They don't talk about their salaries. They don't talk about the arguments they won." He paused. "They talk about people. They talk about whether they were loved and whether they loved back well enough. They talk about moments. Ordinary moments that turned out not to be ordinary." He stopped. "I carry all of that with me. 412 people's versions of what mattered. It makes you very careful with your days." The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey stood in front of Thomas Avery, and for the second time in the conversation was quiet for longer than television usually allows, long enough that the director in the booth said afterward that she had not cut away, not changed the shot, not done anything, because cutting away would have been the wrong thing, and she knew it, and she stayed. He said, 412 people told you what mattered. What was it? What was the thing?" Thomas said without pausing, "Being present, that was it, every time. Not accomplishment, not acquisition, not having won." He said, "Being there, showing up, staying." He looked at Josephine. He said, "Sitting with someone in the hard parts instead of leaving them to it alone." Josephine opened her eyes. She looked at her husband. She said, quietly, not for the room, but the microphone caught it, "That's what you do for us, too." Thomas looked at her. He said, "I know. I learned it from them." The studio fell completely silent, and this time the silence opened into something very large. Large enough to hold 43 minutes at 2 a.m. in a Meridian hospital, and 19 years of Tuesdays and Thursdays, and 412 hands held, and 412 numbers counted, and 31 years of a marriage built by a man who had taken the worst 43 minutes of his life and turned them into a practice of presence, and had, in doing so, brought that practice home. Someone in the back row of the audience was making no sound, which was the laughter of someone who had completely lost control. Except it was not laughter. It was the other thing that makes no sound when it has exceeded all the available volume. 3 crew members were no longer attempting composure. A woman in the fourth row was holding the hand of the man on her left, who was a stranger. The man was letting her. The competing family, the Washingtons from Charlotte, who had come to play a game show and who had been standing at their podium for 31 minutes, learning something they had not expected to learn, stood completely still. Their team captain, a woman named Adeze, 53, who had come in confident and competitive and who was now something else entirely, said nothing. Then she said, "My grandmother died alone." She said it to the room, to no one in particular, to the air. "I didn't know anyone did what you do." Thomas looked at her. He said, "There are more of us than people realize. We just don't talk about it much." He said, "Maybe we should." But Steve wasn't done. He turned to the camera and stood the way he stands when something has shifted the floor and he is standing on the new level. He said, "I want to say something to anyone watching who has lost someone, who has had a 43-minute moment or a longer one, who has arrived and found it was already over." He stopped. "That is not your failure. That is the cruelty of timing and geography and the way these things happen." He paused. "But if you know someone like Thomas, someone who sits in those rooms, who volunteers in a hospice, who does the thing most of us can't, I am asking you to tell them what they do matters." He stopped. "Not eventually. Call them tonight. Tell them their work is seen." He looked at Thomas. He said, "I want to ask you one more thing." Thomas nodded. He said, "What do you say to them? When you're sitting there at the end with someone who is alone, what do you say?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. This was the longest pause of the afternoon, longer than the pause after I sit with people when they're dying, longer than the pause after the 43 minutes. He looked at his hands. He said, "Usually I say, 'I'm here. You're not alone. I've got you.'" He stopped. "And then I say their name." He said, "I think, at the end, hearing your name said by someone who means it is one of the most important things there is. It means you are still a person to someone. It means you are still known." He said, "You are still known." The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey turned away from the camera. He turned away from the audience. He was standing with his back to both for 2 seconds. 2 seconds that 3 cameras caught and that the director did not cut away from. And when he turned back, he was the version of himself that was not performing anything, that was simply a man standing in a room where something true had been. He said, "I don't have anything to add to that." He said it quietly. "I genuinely do not have anything to add to that." Then, because he was Steve Harvey and this was still a game show and the game was still there to be played, he said, "But I'm going to try to be worthy of the next 10 minutes. He picked up his mic card. He looked at it. He looked at Thomas. He said, "You ready?" Thomas said, "I've been ready. I was just waiting for the right moment." Steve Harvey laughed. A real laugh, sudden and full. He said, "Of course you were." He said, "Of course." He shook his head once. "Let's play." But he still wasn't done. Before the round began, he turned to his producers and made the call he made when something had moved him past the game. He said the show was connecting Thomas with the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization to publicize volunteer recruitment. Because what Thomas had said was true, that there were more volunteers than people realized, and that more were needed, and that the show had just spoken to 90 million people who might not know that sitting with someone was something they could do. He said he was personally making a donation to a hospice volunteer training program in Mississippi in Thomas's name. He said in Thomas's name and looked at Thomas when he said it. So Thomas would understand that the naming was deliberate, that being named meant being known, which was something Thomas had just taught him. Thomas nodded once. It was the nod of a man receiving something he did not ask for and did not need, but understood was being given well. The Averys played the bonus round with the focused unity of a family that has just been reminded, in public, of what they are to each other. Marcus played fast money with Celine, and they were good, precise, warm, covering each other's hesitations with the ease of siblings who have been paying attention to each other for a long time. They fell 7 points short of the top prize. They won the secondary amount, and the studio gave them a warm and genuine standing ovation that was not for the game. Adeze Washington, from Charlotte, crossed the stage afterward and stood in front of Thomas. She said, "I want to volunteer." She said it simply, as a statement of a decision that had been made somewhere in the previous 40 minutes. "Can you tell me how?" Thomas told her. He told her in 3 sentences, which was how he told things, efficiently, completely, without excess. She took out her phone and wrote it down. The episode aired 11 days later. By the end of the first day, it had 68 million views. By the end of the week, 91 million. Hospice volunteer organizations across the country reported a surge in inquiries that began within 6 hours of the clip's initial posting and continued for 3 weeks. The largest single-event increase in volunteer interest the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization had recorded in its 47-year history. The organization said so in a press release that thanked, by name, Thomas Avery of Meridian, Mississippi, and noted that 17 new regional volunteer programs had been established in the 8 weeks following the clip's release as a direct result of increased interest. A nurse in Ohio, who had worked in hospice for 11 years, wrote in the comments that she had shown the clip to her entire team at their weekly meeting, and that 3 of them had called their families that evening to say things they had been meaning to say. The comment had 400,000 likes. 3 months later, Thomas Avery had been joined in his volunteer work by 2 people from his church who had watched the clip and called him, and by Adeze Washington, who had driven from Charlotte to complete her training in Meridian, which Thomas had not expected, and which he had received with the equanimity of a man who has learned not to be surprised when people rise to meet something true. He sat with his 413th person in January. He counted. He always counted. A year after the taping, Destiny, which is not the right name, Destiny is from a different story, which is how you know you have been in these stories long enough for the people to start to feel like neighbors. Celine, the pediatric nurse, had moved into a new unit at her hospital. The unit worked with families of children in palliative care. She told the hiring committee that she wanted the work because she had grown up watching her father understand something about presence that most people spend their whole lives trying to name, and she wanted to try to offer what he offered, translated into her own hands and her own hours and her own version of sitting with someone in the hard parts instead of leaving them to it alone. They hired her the same day. Josephine painted. She had always painted. She was an art teacher. She had been painting for 30 years. But after the afternoon on the stage, she started a new series. The series was called, on the card she wrote for the first showing, Ordinary Moments. Each canvas was a scene of someone being present with someone else. A hand on an arm, a face turned toward another face, a kitchen table with 2 cups, a hospital corridor with a person standing very still outside a door. She showed the series at a small gallery in Meridian in the fall. A hospice in the city asked to display 3 of the paintings permanently in their common room. She said yes immediately. She did not charge them. She said the paintings were for the rooms, not for her. Thomas went to the opening. He stood in front of each painting for a long time. Josephine watched him look at her work the way she had always watched him look at things, with his whole attention, leaving nothing out, letting it all the way in. She had loved him for 31 years for many reasons. This was one of them. We move through our days at a pace that is designed, functionally, to prevent us from fully feeling the weight of what we are passing through. The speed is protective. The busyness is insulating. The forward momentum keeps the full measure of our lives at a manageable distance. Thomas Avery had spent 19 years in rooms where the speed was gone, and the busyness was gone, and the forward momentum had stopped. Sitting with people at the precise moment when nothing remained except the truth of what their life had been and who they had loved, and whether they had been present for it. He had heard 412 versions of what mattered at the end, and he had brought all of it home, and he had lived his days accordingly. He was still known to 412 people whose names he counted. He was still known to his wife, who painted the moments that most people moved through too fast to see. He was still known to his children, who had been raised by someone who understood that presence was not a gesture, but a practice, not an occasion, but a daily decision, not the exception, but the whole thing. Steve Harvey asked him one simple question. The answer was the count. The count was the love. The love was the life. That is everything. That is genuinely everything. If this story reached you, if someone's name arrived in your mind while you read it, say their name out loud to them today. And share this with someone who needs to remember what matters. And subscribe, because there are more stories here that have always deserved to be told.